Greetings. Welcome to all. As Director of the Center for International Law at NUS, I'll welcome you to this roundtable. The reason for this roundtable lies in the unfolding tragedy in Myanmar, which in November held democratic elections, resulting in the landslide victory of the National League for Democracy Party, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. This last February, the Myanmar military overthrew these election results through a military intervention, a military coup. Aung San Suu Kyi was jailed and has not been heard of or seen since. The people of Myanmar have launched a massive and unprecedented civil resistance. All sectors of civil society are resisting through general strikes and street protests, and in particular, the youth. The military response has been brutal. The military itself acknowledges, last I checked, 164 deaths, whereas others report close to 300. Yesterday, tragically, the military shot and killed a 7-year-old child. Our roundtable discussion today on ASEAN and Myanmar, balancing the ASEAN Charter and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, is set against this somber and tragic background. We have today as our moderator, Professor Tommy Koh, a very well-known name around the world, who was directly involved in the drafting of the ASEAN Charter, and also a very distinguished group of ASEAN law experts on our roundtable. I now turn the floor over to Professor Koh.
Thank you, Nilufer, for your welcome remarks. I want to join you and thank the 4 distinguished speakers for accepting our invitation to participate in this very important webinar. I will briefly introduce the 4 speakers in the order in which I will request them to speak. First, Professor Walter Woon. I'm an old friend and admirer of Professor Woon, who has distinguished himself both in the law and in diplomacy. He is the David Marshall Professor of Law at the National University of Singapore. He has served successfully as Singapore's ambassador to Germany and to the European Union. He's also served as Singapore's Attorney General. In 2007, Professor Woon and I were appointed by the Singapore government to represent Singapore in the high-level task force which drafted the ASEAN Charter. And Professor Woon is the author of a very good book, the ASEAN Charter, or Commentary. I would also say that Professor Woon and I and Rosario Manolo co-edited a book on the making of the ASEAN Charter. Our second speaker is a friend from Malaysia, Professor Rahmat Mohamad. Professor Rahmat is currently the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Technology at Mara. He had previously served as Dean of the Law School of the same university. And Nilufer tells me that he was a very successful Secretary General of the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization. I'm very pleased to have a Malaysian colleague on this panel. Third, another old friend, Professor Maitri Ong Twin. Professor Maitri is currently the Deputy Director of the Asia Research Institute at the National University. He's a historian from Myanmar and teaches in the Department of History at this university. He's author of a very good book, A History of Myanmar from Ancient Time, Traditions and Transformation. The 4th speaker is one of my dear colleagues at the center, Professor Tan Sian Lee. Professor Tan is a co-director of our program on ASEAN law and policy. She is the author of 2 very good books, one on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and another book with a provocative title, Does ASEAN Take Rights Seriously? Now, I want to pose my 3 questions to the panel. Oh no, before I do that, I want to make another point. I want to join Nilufer in saying that the current situation in Myanmar is a tragedy. It has caused the death of over 200 people, including an 8-year-old girl. It has aborted Myanmar's transition to democracy. I thank Indonesia for leadership in this crisis. Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi has been leading the ASEAN foreign ministers in quest of a solution. The ASEAN foreign ministers have held one virtual meeting. And more recently, the president of Indonesia, Pak Jokowi, has proposed an ASEAN hold a summit to discuss Myanmar. This has the support of Singapore. I think the ASEAN countries agree on the following 5 points. First, what happened on the 1st of February was a military coup. It was not, as somebody else said, a cabinet reshuffle. Second, the democratically elected leaders of Myanmar, led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, should be released from detention. 3, the military regime is not the legitimate government of Myanmar. 4, it is wrong for the military to use lethal force against unarmed civilians. And finally, the ASEAN consensus is that the NLD and the military should return to the negotiating table and resolve their differences peacefully. ASEAN can act as a facilitator. So I now come to my 3 questions. First, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of ASEAN country is enshrined in Article 2, subparagraph 2, subparagraph D of the ASEAN Charter. My question is this an absolute principle? My second question, in Article 228 of the Charter, ASEAN member states commit themselves to adhere to the rule of law, good governance, the principle of democracy, and constitutional government. My question is this: does constitutional government mean that ASEAN will not recognize changes of government brought about by force of arms or unconstitutional means? I go on to my third and final question. I see on TV some protesters holding up placards with the words R2P. R2P means responsibility to protect. And my question to the panelists is, has the current situation in Myanmar fulfilled the condition for the invocation of the doctrine of responsibility to protect? Has the military committed such egregious violations of human rights of its own people as to warrant international intervention? I will now call on the first panelist, Professor Woon, to respond.
Thank you very much, Professor Koh, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me make one thing clear right at the start, all right? What is being done by the military in Myanmar is odious. Let's not forget that. But we, as ASEAN and as the world, are faced with difficult choices. And the fact that we do not outright condemn them, sanction them, or whatever it is, does not mean we approve of what is done. Right? Very quickly, since we have many questions, let me just look at the charter. Professor Koh is well qualified to answer all these questions, but he's handed this over to me. Non-interference first appeared in the Zone of Neutrality, Peace and Freedom Declaration 1971. that basically you don't interfere in other people's, in other countries' domestic affairs, and that was done against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. And of course, all the countries in ASEAN have been colonized, usually on the pretext that some foreign power can run us better than we can. Right? So the forward movement in Malaysia, for example, the civilizing mission in Indonesia, in Indochina, that the French took upon themselves, all of these were excuses to interfere in people's domestic politics. Article 2.E should be read with Article 2.F, respect for the right of every member state to lead its national existence free from external interference, subversion, and coercion. And that came word for word from the 1976 Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. And those words were a direct result of the colonial experience of ASEAN countries. And even though Thailand was not formally colonized, it had bits of its territory locked off by the colonial powers. So we have to understand that that's the background. But non-interference doesn't mean supinely accepting what goes on. The analogy that has been used for ASEAN, and certainly in the diplomatic circles where we had ASEAN committees in various capitals, the analogy that was used was to a family. You don't want outsiders poking their nose in, but the senior members of the family can take people aside and say, hey, look, this is wrong. It affects all of us. Will you please reconsider? Think carefully. Non-interference doesn't mean don't do anything. Non-interference means do it quietly. Do it outside the glare of publicity. Don't do it so that you can posture to the world that you are a defender of rights, so that when you write your autobiography, you can say, well, I did this and I did that. Non-interference means in ASEAN that you don't want to lecture people publicly or whack them with sanctions. Professor Koh will remember our session in Siem Reap when we were discussing the ASEAN Charter, how some countries said, look, we're not going to put up with any discussion of expulsion or suspension. Right? And that was a very, 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 very strong red line among some of those countries. You want to lecture people and put sanctions on them, then what? What follows? What follows? This is the point. Right? This is the point. If we're talking about the commitment to constitutional governments, our Indonesian friends were very strong on this. Yeah. I recall. They were very strong on this. But it was ironic because the ASEAN Charter was signed on behalf of Thailand by General Surayu Chulanong. Had been installed after a coup. It's signed. Right? At that time, also 2007, mass protests in Myanmar, the Saffron Revolution, was suppressed.
Yeah.
So we have a theory and we have a practice. The theory is we're committed to this. We're committed to this. It's not that this point is useless. It does give the other ASEAN countries some leverage to go to the countries where there have been unconstitutional changes to say, you guys signed up to this, live up to it. Live up to it. And we're not Europeans and Americans down here. We're your own family. We're saying, look, it's hurting the family. It's hurting the family, right? You know what? There was another coup in Thailand in May 2014.
Yes.
Shortly after the 24th ASEAN Summit. 24th ASEAN Summit. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono of Indonesia was most direct. He declared that the ASEAN Charter made it obligatory for members to respect the democratic values and human rights. So the president of Indonesia came out then, as President Widodo has come out, President Jokowi, Pak Jokowi has come out. So Indonesia is saying these things. And Indonesia can say these things because Indonesia has had the transition from military rule to civilian rule. It's had that. It has the moral right to say this. Right? But what do we do? What do we do? This is the problem. What are the options available to the world? You talk about right to protect, or obligation to protect. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean you send in the troops? Right? We've seen what's happened in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Iraq. Has it made life for people any better? People who talk right to protect need to go back and understand history. You don't just send in troops and remove the regime. You've got to stay. You've got to indulge in long-term nation building. Right? The Americans may think that their experience with Japan and Germany after the Second World War is typical. It was not typical. They went in, they poured in money through the Marshall Plan, they stayed for generations, and the reason they did this was not pure altruism. The reason they did this was countering communism. Soviet troops across the border, PRC, the People's Republic of China. They did that, long-term, generational. So what do you want? You talk about right to protect. Whose troops are going in? Whose sons and fathers and husbands do you want to send in to be killed on behalf of the community? Who's going to spend the money? So let's be very clear about this, all right? Intervention by military means in Myanmar is impractical. No European government would ever think about this, no matter how much noise they make. The Americans have had enough, and they're still stuck with the tar babies of Iraq and Afghanistan. Do not expect ASEAN to do anything. We don't have the military ability or the economic ability. That's the first thing, right? So that's the first thing. We can't intervene militarily. Second, sanctions. Sanctions. Has sanctions really worked? Half a century of sanctions on Cuba. How well has that worked? How well has that worked? Sanctions on Iran, on North Korea. The problem is that sanctions are never 100% watertight. Right? Kim Jong-un in North Korea still gets his luxuries. He still gets his luxuries. There's no way to stop it. They've just cut diplomatic links with Malaysia because of, Malaysia did the right thing by expelling, by extraditing someone who's breaching sanctions. Sanctions just make the people who are doing the sanctioning feel good about themselves. They don't necessarily do anything, and they certainly hurt the ordinary folks. So what are we left with? Adapting the Sherlock Holmes method, having eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how unpalatable, is the solution. You have to talk to the military, odious though they are, because if you don't talk to them, how do you expect to bring change? The Americans had no problem with talking to military people who basically committed military coups. Park Chung-hee in South Korea, Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Did they say sanction them, don't ever talk to them, don't engage them? No, they didn't. They supported South Korea, and South Korea transitioned to democracy. Chile has transitioned to democracy. One of the most difficult things I had to do as ambassador in Europe was to defend this position that we need to engage with Myanmar. Myanmar has to be part of our family, despite our disapproval of what is happening in Myanmar. The most difficult thing was to be thanked by the Myanmar ambassador for defending Myanmar. But that is the unfortunate reality. If we do not engage, who are they going to learn how to build a proper modern state from? Who are they going to learn this from? From North Korea? From Cuba? From Iran? Myanmar, the Myanmar military regime will not lack friends because of realpolitik. If ASEAN opts out, there will be contestation. Not for nothing that Myanmar is considered the Balkans, potentially the Balkans of Southeast Asia. You go in, you displace the government, that doesn't mean that they will live happily ever after. It means that if ASEAN goes in, or whoever wants to go in, they inherit the problems of Myanmar.
Yeah, okay.
That's the problem. Okay, so just to wind up, so I'm sorry, I'm taking so much time, but just to wind up very quickly, we have no choice but to carry on dialogue with them, to persuade them, but to do this quietly and not by shouting in public as some people want, because that's never going to change their minds. You do not dislodge people with guns by shouting at them.
Thank you.
Back to you, Professor.
Thank you, Walter, for your words of realism and wisdom. Professor Ratnat, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Tomiko, and thank you so much for inviting me, Center of International Law and US. I'm in full agreement with Professor Walter Woon, particularly in relation to the fact that we have no choice but to talk to our friend in Myanmar. And, you know, ASEAN in the first era or the first part of ASEAN was very much to ensure that this region is safe, secure, and people live in harmony. I think that's the very idea, the raison d'etre of ASEAN is that. The second part of ASEAN, when we talk about ASEAN Charter, brings about rule of law, democracy, the importance of looking at all this part to ensure that, again, ASEAN live in harmony. And this is very important. So the centrality of ASEAN is very important, that no one can just ignore the existence of ASEAN. And we have done very well the first part of ASEAN. But the second part is the challenge. We have Myanmar from the very beginning giving us a lot of problems. We took Myanmar as part of ASEAN. We took Myanmar because we believe that we are a family in this region. So that's region we defended Myanmar against EU when they came in as part of ASEAN. So what I'm not happy about is the charter, because while the charter say respect the principle of territorial integrity, there is this principle of non-interference. So you wanted to make ASEAN as a rule-based regional organization, giving it personality, legal personality, but then you have this idea of non-interference. Of course, this is to echo the UN Charter, the Westphalian construct of non-intervention. However, non-intervention principle or the doctrine of non-intervention under be it the Westphalian construct or the UN Charter, they have limitation. They have limitation, not necessarily that it should be observed fully. But of course, I agree with Professor Walter Woon that military intervention is not the option. We do not want other than ASEAN entities to come in to this part of the world. We have seen the destruction of Vietnam. We do not want that to happen in this part of the world. And I think it is very important that we need to ensure that the talk have to be continued. And this is very important. As you say, the military is not easy to talk to, but my experience with Myanmar when I was in India as the secretary of the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization. We hardly talk during official meeting with the ambassador, but we do talk during our golf session. So there is a possibility of golf diplomacy. In other words, it's not that difficult to ensure that negotiation or discussion with the other side of the party. So I think we need to do that. And R2P, that it is not law. And I think ASEAN countries as a whole is not ready to accept this doctrine of R2P. And I think that will be the worst case scenario for us, allowing or giving that not permission, but just looking at the foreign military coming in to Myanmar and in the hope that everything will come back to order or restoring democracy. That's not the idea at all. I think they have a problem. We need to help them. And I think the only way to do is to call them and to discuss. I think that is possible as a family of this part of the world. And sanction too is not also the answer, because it will be worse off. They will be worse off with sanction. So I think I go along with Professor Walter Woon on this, and I think there is a solution. Perhaps we should establish a sort of conciliatory body comprises of friends of ASEAN or where perhaps acceptable by Myanmar, and let's talk about this, ensuring that the road to peace and democracy will be gained by Myanmar. So thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rahmat. Professor Maitri, can we have your wise words, please?
Thank you. I'll keep it short. In terms of being an absolute principle, I think it depends on who you ask, especially for those in Myanmar. I mean, the protesters today will say it's not absolute, and while the security forces will probably say it is. Ethnic groups are so divided, they will probably have mixed views on this issue. I agree with both of the previous speakers who said this is historically contextualized. There's a reason for this because of colonialism, Cold War, and globalization. But I think, today with great powers like China, India, the US, and the EU already exerting pressure on countries like Myanmar, ASEAN's position of non-interference provides an important alternative, for it gives both Myanmar and ASEAN more options to resolve this crisis. In terms of the second question, which I think I'll spend a little bit more time to regarding the constitutional government and whether or not we recognize the changes of governance by force of arms. I mean, I think the principles of governance in the Charter are more aspirational for some nations rather than operational. I think it's important to remember that each country's histories and cultures, demographics, levels of development, and politics all differ, which makes implementation and the efficacy of liberal democratic systems, hard to implement, and it depends on context and circumstances in which they are established. So I think it's important, again, depends on who you ask in Myanmar. Look, Myanmar has been in the midst of civil war since 1945, and the country is divided. The state and its institutions have been historically weak. The central government does not control its own borders, and the current constitutional system that we are evaluating was only established in 2008. It's a work in progress. So what I think we're seeing is a detour, not a departure from the roadmap to democracy. I think the establishment of emergency law in February indicates to me that the internal mechanisms to cope with disputes are inherently weak. And so helping them strengthen their ability to manage these and future crises will probably be more useful at this time. So I think that Myanmar's democracy is still a work in progress. Different stakeholders also have different ideas about what democracy means. And so we have to keep these types of thoughts in mind. And finally, I think it's worth mentioning in terms of constitutional governance. and this may push slightly against you, Professor Koh, in some of your statements earlier, that the military authorities actually see themselves as operating within the constitutional framework that was established in 2008. And they are not seeking to overhaul it, I think. General Min Aung Hlaing has stated that they want to reset the system after new elections, which in my analysis is an attempt to continue the system that brought U Thein Sein and Daw Aung San Suu Kyi to Naypyidaw. I think we should be asking, what are the intentions of the military, given that they have not sought to change the existing governance structures? And I'm sure we can talk a little bit more about that in discussion and questions. And finally, about the R2P issue, let me say right off the bat that I think the military's crackdown on the civilian protesters is deplorable and heartbreaking. I have family and friends who have been directly and indirectly affected by both the protesters, the lockdowns and so forth, and the security forces' responses to them. I think intervention will cause more problems than resolve, as the other two speakers have suggested. And I think, as they also mentioned, there are plenty of examples to draw comparisons. I think international intervention will bring external actors more overtly into an ongoing civil war that will further weaken an already fragile state system of governance. I think concentrating on strengthening and supporting domestic mechanisms for conflict management that are already present in the current constitutional system might be a more long-term sustainable course of action for ASEAN, especially since pretty much all the stakeholders want are pretty much the same thing: peace, prosperity, unity, and opportunity. They agree on the destination. They just differ on which road to take, who will navigate, and who will drive. I think the way forward, is to identify the bridges that unite the different stakeholders. And I think these lay in bread and butter issues: housing, education, healthcare, jobs, infrastructure. And given that ASEAN is already sort of pushing towards integration, both at the cultural level, economic and political level, these are the things that ASEAN does best. And I think Myanmar can benefit from it. Thanks.
Thank you, Maitri. Maitri, can I press you on a major point you made?
Sure.
You said the military doesn't object to the Constitution and they wish to operate within the Constitution. If that is the case, why did they push aside the democratically elected government, declare a state of emergency, and are they not trying to maybe not change the Constitution, but change the electoral system so that when they hold election in a year's time, there's a greater prospect that a military-backed political party may come to power democratically?
Yes, that's where the crux of the matter is, I think. I don't think they're changing the system, nor are they even changing the electoral system. What they are claiming, from their own words, is that there was electoral fraud. There were over 10 million cases or claims of fraudulent action during the election out of 39 million voters. That's over a quarter of the voters of the voting population. And that process, which I think is at the heart of this matter, is an electoral dispute, one that should have been resolved by the Union Electoral Commission, one of these internal dispute management mechanisms that frankly didn't work. And I think that's what happened, is that they stepped in to nullify the electoral results because they saw it as being flawed. And I think that's where ASEAN perhaps can step in, is if the military is actually going to see themselves holding new elections, well, perhaps ASEAN can be involved in the supervision of the process. This time around, there weren't as many observers during the elections, partly because of COVID. And I think this might have been part of the challenge. So I think that if they are going to move forward with these elections and rehold them, first, they need to include the NLD in those elections. They need to release all those folks that have been detained, and they need to be included. If they are going to supervise the election and see the entire process restarted, then I think that's where ASEAN can come in. I think all the statements are pretty clear that they don't want to overhaul the system and introduce something new. In '62, when they stepped in, they overhauled the colonial system and established a new socialist system of governance, starting with the Revolutionary Council that ended up being very much a socialist form of governance. This time when they stepped in, they didn't say they were going to change the system, but they were definitely focusing on the elections. And so I think that aspect might be where ASEAN can step in. And part of the challenge, of course, is people don't believe the military because of all the violence that's occurred on the ground. And that's the problem. That issue about the elections has been overshadowed by the horror and the trauma of children being killed, of everyday citizens being shot, and so forth. But I think if we look at what they have done in terms of what their statements are, I think we should be cognizant of the fact that institutions haven't been changed. And more importantly, the folks that they put into the cabinet and the state administrative council are Thein Sein's administrative folks. So many of them were from that previous administration. Those guys are seen as reformers. And so I think it's worth investigating this type of angle a little bit more, because perhaps that's where an entry point towards dialogue can emerge.
On the allegation of election fraud, isn't it true that international election observers declared that on the whole, the election was free and fair?
Yes, it was true. Many of the groups that were there, despite COVID, did make that statement, as did local observers who were part of the process. I think the issue that the military was raising was that many of the claims, those 1 million claims that needed to be investigated through the internal mechanisms that are part of the process, were not pursued. And so while the external observers said, yes, more or less free and fair, I think the issue has to do with the internal processes that the military probably expected to be followed, which they claim were not. And that's where the dispute management aspects need to come in. And perhaps, as I said, that's where ASEAN can step in.
You made the important point, Maitri, that in any new election, the NLD must not be excluded. So my question is, what about Daw Suu? Because the military seemed determined to eliminate her as a political rival. You know, with all these charges that have been brought against her, would the new election be legitimate if Daw Suu were disqualified?
Yeah, that's a tough question, Prof. Ko. I mean, because there have been charges laid against her, which are separate from the issues of the systems and the electoral process. I think in terms of optics and overall trust in governments that this whole process has been trying to accomplish, you know, since 2008. I think frankly she has to be allowed to come out and to compete in the elections as she did before. However, those separate charges that have been laid, they also need to be probably explored as well. But I don't think that an electoral system necessarily is valid or invalid based on the presence of a candidate, but a person's exclusion from the process. I mean, to me, that's the real issue. If those charges are actually faulty, then she should be able to compete. She should be able to canvass in the elections and so forth. So I think that's where the real murky, difficult stuff is going to come out. And that's where, as I said, that's where I think mediation is needed. Mediation and not weapons, you know, dialogue, and not bullets.
Okay, thank you. Let me call on Prof. Tan Sian Lee to speak. Thank you, Sandy, for waiting.
Oh no, thanks, Prof. Ko. Thanks everyone before me. So I just wanted to follow on Prof. Ko's question before I actually give a little exposition on your 3 questions. So, Prof. Maitri, so you said regarding, the electoral fraud, the army came in because they were unhappy that, the allegations were not investigated. But to date, well, at least in the English media, and I think many international observers are asking like, okay, the allegations, serious allegations of electoral fraud. But even before they start investigation, surely there must be some proof. And we have not seen this in the media. So where is, the fraud happening? What are the instances that led to so many spoilt votes or compromised votes that then led to a loss in the investigation process, and then the army came in and effectively stole the election, right? So 1, 2, 3, what happened?
Yes, I think that's what's needed. I absolutely agree that if they're going to make the allegation and step in, they need to show where the evidence is. They need to show, where are these points of fraud, these million points of fraud, and so forth. So I absolutely agree that should be the focus. That should be part of the discussion. And right now, the military, frankly, as usual, is really poor with their internal and external communications. They're just terrible at it. They've barely even touched that issue, even though that's fundamentally the basis of their actions of declaring emergency law. So absolutely, I agree. That needs to come out. And I think, if anything, in terms of prodding our neighbor along or encouraging our neighbor to along, I think that's where ASEAN should be focusing on. Encourage them to open up the investigation, show us the evidence, because otherwise this process is not going to move forward. So I think you're absolutely right to raise that. I think that's where we need to look at it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so based on the 3 questions, is the, non-interference principle. So basically, I think, to the scholars who are part of the audience or the practitioners who are part of the audience, collectively, no, non-interference is, non-interference is something that all the ASEAN members hold dear. But bilaterally and behind the scenes, there is interference, right? Or rather, there is discussion, just no shaming. So where are the instances where ASEAN has collectively, or at least a cluster of member states, where they have come up to talk on, member state problems? This is where egregious violations have occurred, and unfortunately, most of such interference or public interference that ASEAN has conducted has to do with Myanmar. So like the Saffron Revolution, Cyclone Nargis, and of course, I think if we're discussing Myanmar, we cannot leave out the Rohingya issue, the Rohingya crisis, and ASEAN has also come in to talk about this, right? So, and also with regard to the elections, it's not just the individual member states who have come up to in the aftermath of the coup, but also now, collectively, where we seem to be moving towards a special summit collectively, and the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights, 4 representatives made a public statement to say, this is wrong, we are very concerned, and there are human rights violations going on. So it's not that ASEAN or ASEAN agencies are not doing anything, but they are working perhaps not fast enough for everybody, or not in the way that everybody wants, right? On the second question on constitutional governance, rule of law, so on and so forth, I think let's, so we're all in stages of, improving, strengthening democratic government, no criticism, or so on and so forth, and citizens of ASEAN member states obviously want their governments to work better for them. So let's just boil down to the essence of the issue that this is state responsibility of good governance, rule of law to the citizens, and where, constitutional government has been wrested away from the citizens, whether, other ASEAN member states would be going to engage with these, incoming or usurpers, I think increasingly not. So I think under these circumstances, especially with such gross violations of human rights, I find it very difficult to imagine that the present ASEAN leaders would sit, well, they would sit at the same table, but would they recognize, right? Perhaps not. Yeah, and Prof. Koh's starting of this webinar, he said that there were 4 points and the ASEAN leaders said, no, we are not going to recognize you, the Tatmadaw, right? And lastly, on the R2P, I have to agree. So I have been following the issue very closely, and on social media, I know many Myanmar citizens, friends of Myanmar have posted, replies, responses, comments, and say, please help Myanmar, please international community intervene. So in the beginning stages, I was wondering, what do you mean intervene? Physical intervention? Do we all understand the ramification of that? It is a disaster upon disaster. And also, if we're talking about political or international law issues on R2P, it has been a tradition of ASEAN member states that we do not really agree with R2P, especially if it's R2P in the sense of humanitarian intervention of physical force, troops coming in. So it would be, yes, I know it sounds weak and it seems futile, but I think mediation and negotiation are the only ways. So what are the ways that are available to us? So before Myanmar transited to democracy, ASEAN was actively engaged in holding the junta to the roadmap to democracy, and it moved towards, Myanmar moved towards elections, second election, so on and so forth. So perhaps if that formula worked and if parties are amenable to it, perhaps there can be another roadmap and to hold the parties to this roadmap. Yeah. They're very good questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Niloufar, I think you will agree with me that all 4 panelists spoke very well. And basically, we are converging on a few common points. That non-interference doesn't mean that we can't engage quietly with the authorities to persuade them that what they are doing is not correct, to show them best practice. Yes, constitutional government means not recognizing extra constitutional changes of government, but it is more an aspirational statement than an operating principle, But still, it's good to have aspiration. And we can hold our brothers and sisters in ASEAN countries and say, look at the charter. This is our aspiration. We want constitutional government. We don't want government to change by armed force or by unconstitutional means. And I think on R2P, I must say, I'm actually quite heartbroken to tell all the young people in Myanmar that we understand your plight, your sadness, but military intervention is not possible and is not really in the interests of the people of Myanmar. So, Niloufar, let me go back to you and ask whether there are good questions online that you want to ask the panelists to answer.
Thank you, Prof. Ko, and also I want to thank the panelists for their very thoughtful and I have to say sobering and perhaps clear-eyed examination of a very difficult emotional situation. So I have to join in saying that sometimes the answers are not easy ones, and I think that we had a very honest discussion. And we had some very good questions. And I have to say, this is the first time we've had many webinars where we had many questions that came in advance, actually. So what I'm going to do is try and look at those that seem to cover the same theme from those that we already received and the new ones. And so I will just ask them a few because they do overlap. So one question is, there seems to be a conflict between non-interference and the ability of ASEAN to be seen as effective, as an effective regional bloc. Is there a way to resolve this? And another one is, how is ASEAN and Singapore to play a mediating role without legitimizing the Burmese military through engagement? And last, Indonesian President Joko Widodo recently called for a high-level meeting in ASEAN to discuss the Myanmar crisis. What are the panelists' views on this idea? Is an ASEAN high-level meeting which will discuss only Myanmar's domestic issues necessary and possible as well as effective? So I think these questions follow nicely.
Okay, thank you. So we have three good questions. Let me turn to the panel and ask, I think I'll go reverse order, whether they would like to answer any one or all of the three questions. I begin with you, Sandy. Sandy, would you like to answer any of the questions?
Regarding, I think the one that I feel most strongly about is about the efficacy of ASEAN and non-interference. So, I mean, you know, this is a perennial criticism of ASEAN. I think we don't do something so well, but I think on the things that we do work very hard on and we do get some outcome, we don't publicize it, or at least there is very little transparency. So if we had data, right, to show, I think it's a matter of public relations or of data, because and obviously these are very tough issues, so they take a lot of time, they take a lot of effort, and obviously very many people will be unhappy with the outcome. But, you know, it is a positive trend, and if we do let the public know, I think there would be less dissatisfaction. Regarding the Singapore issue, I would love to hear other people's thoughts. Yeah.
Okay. Maitri?
Yes, in terms of the efficacy of ASEAN, I'd also agree. I think ASEAN's method is behind the scenes. It doesn't posture like other countries do. And so I think the results is in the pudding. And we've already seen them act during other crises involving Myanmar, and they've done it effectively. And it was also behind the scenes. So I think they shouldn't change what they're doing just for the sake of public appearances and to placate perhaps criticism from the outside. About the very interesting question about how do you engage without legitimizing the military? I mean, that question is premised on the fact that, or on the assumption that the military is not going to be involved in governance for the future of the country. I think we have to sort of accept that the military is a part of governance structures, partly because the state is weak and has been since World War II. And so for the moment, the military is involved. And I think with more engagement, I think we will see the development of institutions and structures that will lead more towards the civilian side of this sort of spectrum. But for the most of Myanmar history, it's been a civilian military hybrid form of government. So I think we need to accept that they are a player. We need to find ways to engage them. About the final question about ASEAN meetings, I think, actually I wasn't sure, sorry what the final question was about ASEAN meetings. I thought, is it just about Myanmar? I think
high-level meetings.
I think these high-level meetings will also provide reference for other countries that are also struggling with some of these same types of tensions about governance, about the rule of law, about civilian military regions. I mean, the military is involved in a lot of different governments throughout the region, so it's not just Myanmar.
Thank you. Professor Rahmat?
Thank you. I would like to talk about the role of ASEAN, the fact that the very nature of the ASEAN Charter is to promote ASEAN centrality. And I think this is very important because I'm not sure whether there is a way to reconstruct the idea of non-interference to make it more practical in that sense, But I think this requires further thoughts. Well, I do not want to go into that because it will become an academic exercise. But I think the way to do it is to adhere to what we have been doing right. That is the ASEAN way of informality, rather than the formal way of doing things. And I think this worked very well. And of course, the idea of working informality would also incorporate the idea of working quietly. That sort of diplomacy should continue, and hopefully by doing that, something will come up at the end of the day, because that's the best way of doing. I mean, that has been the best formula for ASEAN. And whether the idea of working with military junta is good or bad for government. I think there is no escape of doing that. I think you can't avoid, because I don't know whether it's culturally it is like that in Myanmar, that you can't always work with the officials. You know, as we understood what is official, it could be a, you know, the military is so powerful, and perhaps we have to do that and continue doing that and talk to the military. At the end of the day, I think we have to come up with the roadmap. I think as colleagues said, there is already a roadmap to democracy. I think we have to continuously doing that consistently. And this idea of non-interference is actually something that bothers me a lot, you know, because we will end up just writing pages of it just come out with academic exercise. You know, it wonders the European, for example, what do you mean by ASEAN way? What do you mean by doing your own way? But to us, that is the best way of doing things in this part of the world. The idea of consultation and consensus, this still play an important role, you know. And to top it up, if we want to put under the mold of customary international law in terms of state practice and opinion juries, this is something that is quite difficult for us to match that with that Western construct of international customary law. You know, so I think we leave it to the wisdom of ASEAN leaders to handle the situation and to continue talking to the military in Myanmar. I think that is the best way of doing things here in ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Walter, please, Walter.
Publicizing what you do is contradictory to doing things quietly. That is the fundamental problem. Think of a family. If you've got a troublesome family member and you want to counsel him, you first make an announcement, we're going to counsel him. We're going to discipline him. Do you do that? Is he going to listen? The chances are you just destroy all chance of compromise. So whatever the public may think and whatever the Westerners may think, in ASEAN, our attitude has always been, keep it within the family, let's talk. Now, talking to someone doesn't mean accepting what he does, right? Again, let us use the family analogy. If one of the family members is committing adultery, you want to talk him out of this and say, look, don't do this, it hurts the family image. You're not condoning the adultery, you're just talking to him. If you don't talk to him, you don't talk to the military in Myanmar, how are you going to communicate with them? By telepathy? No, you can't. You have to talk to them. Talking to them does not mean you accept what we do. That is fuzzy thinking, to think that by talking, you are accepting them. Yeah. No. What can ASEAN and Singapore do? What ASEAN and Singapore can do? Well, I don't think we can say Singapore, because Singapore is very small, little red dot. But ASEAN can tell the Myanmar generals, look, you're not going to progress. Your country is not going to progress doing it the way you're doing. And that's why Indonesia is such an important player, because Indonesia has made that transition. It may be that we will have to accept a compromise, something like Indonesian Dwi-fungsi, where there was, you understand the concept of Dwi-fungsi, which basically gave the
military
Republic of Indonesia a role in governance, and then they evolved from that. Basically, just to borrow a phrase from the Clinton campaign, it's the economy, stupid. ASEAN goes to them and say, look, if the economy is stupid, you want to develop your country, then don't do it this way, for goodness sake. This is a dumb way to do it. You just set yourself back a generation. We have our interests at heart. We're not former colonialists trying to grandstand and promote our values. We're interested in making sure that all of us in ASEAN are progressing. And we have examples. We've got Indonesia. If we want to get help from our friends in Asia, there's Korea. And I'm going to say something that's going to have the heavens open up and hit me with lightning. And there's China, not the PRC, the Republic of China. The nationalists in Taiwan transitioned from military authoritarianism to democracy. Koreans have developed the economy. Taiwanese have developed the economy. Indonesia is heading upwards. That, I think, with all humility, it's the way that Singapore and others can try and persuade these fellows. Look, you keep on going like this, you're going to be the sixth man of ASEAN for the next 2 generations. But publicizing what you do, the contradiction. This kind of behind the scenes thing has worked before. Prea Via. Do you remember Thailand and Cambodia, the dispute over Prea Via?
Yeah.
The first time it was tried by our foreign minister, Giorgio. He invited the foreign ministers down to Singapore, no publicity, talked, they went to the Botanic Gardens, had a nice lunch, talked, but the Thais were not willing to move. And subsequently, the Indonesian foreign minister, Pak Mati Natalegawa, shuttled between the capitals and finally got the Thais and the Cambodians, the Thais especially, to agree to having Indonesian observers stationed to separate the forces. In the end, the Indonesian observers were not stationed, but the shooting stopped. The shooting stopped. So yeah, if we can persuade the Myanmar military that they're heading down the wrong road, that they should actually let elections be held with ASEAN observers, that would, I think, be a realistic aim, but you don't do this by announcing beforehand and humiliating people.
Yeah, I agree, Bill. Walter, I agree with you. And I also agree that the best ASEAN interlocutor is Indonesia. I therefore support the leadership role that Indonesia is playing, both at the foreign minister level and at the leaders level. Yeah. So Niloufar, let's have 3 more questions.
Yes, so one question here that I have on screen that I think is a question about this ASEAN Way. And it says, the lack of posturing by ASEAN is making the Myanmar public lose faith in whether ASEAN has a genuine interest in the will of Myanmar's people. To this end, if it continues such a trajectory, any resolution with an ASEAN stamp of approval may not be palatable for the Myanmar people. So it's an interesting perspective. Another group of questions have to do more with external actors. And there's one asking a question about the continuity of certain organizations, international organizations, such as the World Bank and other financial commitments in Myanmar. And also we have some questions here that have to do, what are the obligations of other states to recognize or not the military regime as the government of Myanmar? And again, the role of the United Nations, what role does the UN have? So that's a little more than 3, but gives opportunity to answer different questions.
So if I may ask Niloufar for permission, I want to answer the first question. I want to assure the people of Myanmar that the rest of the ASEAN family care very much about their welfare and about their future. And if we seem ineffective in our response to this crisis, it is because the other way, the Western way, doesn't work, And I want to prove to the people of Myanmar that we have been helpful in the past when Myanmar faced with other crises. I refer to the instant when Myanmar was hit by Cyclone Nargis. when that happened, the government of President Tencent's first reaction was that they don't need international help. They said, we don't want any help from the outside world. And the ASEAN foreign minister managed to persuade the Myanmaris at a very critical, informal ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in Singapore that this is wrong and that they are not in a position to help themselves. They need help and they should open their door. And to reassure them that foreign aid will not threaten them, the ASEAN country decided to set up a tripartite mechanism consisting of ASEAN, the UN, and the Myanmar government. And it is this tripartite framework that receive foreign assistance, help to implement them, monitor its delivery. And so we solved a problem. We persuaded the Myanmar government to move from the initial position that our doors are closed, we don't want any foreign assistance, to accepting foreign assistance, but through this tripartite mechanism. So I want to tell the people in Myanmar that we have proven in the past that we care for you, and in our ASEAN way was able to bring about a change in the attitude of the Myanmar government. So I want to turn to the panel now and ask whether they'd like to respond to the question. I will begin with Walter this time. Walter, please.
You said all there is to say, Tommy. Frankly, sorry, can you just repeat the questions for me? I don't think.
I think one question, Walter, is there a role for the UN, and what is the role of the UN?
I don't think that if ASEAN can't succeed, I don't see the UN doing any better. In fact, the UN could do a lot worse. If we can go back to Priya Vea, remember when Pak Mati went to the UN Security Council, the Security Council was very happy and said, yeah, you guys, you fix it. It's your family problem. You want to deal with it. We're very happy you deal with it. I don't see the UN. The UN's got enough crises on its hands.
Yeah.
When ASEAN says, we're going to take care of this, you guys cut out, I think they'd be very happy to leave it with us. I don't see that they can do much better.
And also the reality, Walter, is that in the Security Council, there are two countries which support the military, and they will veto any resolution that is inimical to the interests of the military. So that's the reality. ASEAN, UN can't help.
May I make one further point following what you said, Tommy? And that is, once we bring it to the UN, it's going to get embroiled in the US rivalry. And then we will absolutely have no solution.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Professor Rahmat, please.
Yes, I agree with Professor Walter Woon regarding the role of the UN. They will make it worse. They will go to the Security Council and they will debate, and finally they will probably give the solution that military intervention is the best. So I don't think we should allow them. And I think this is where ASEAN must work together and say that we don't need the UN Security Council to come in. We will solve through our way. Like it or not, one may criticize ASEAN way of doing things, but I think for us at the moment, because we have levels of achievement of democracy in ASEAN, we have to allow countries that have not achieved that roadmap, the successful, the so-called democracy. I think we need to help them. We need to promote them. We have to tell them the best way is, again, by talking. I think that is something that we have to convince, because I know now there will be, perhaps idea that military intervention is the best and they will come in and it will not solve the problem. It will cause instability even in the region if that is going to happen. I think we do not want that. And I think the idea of ASEAN Way, as I said, it has its limitation, but I think that is the best way for us at the moment in dealing with Myanmar. That much I would like to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahmat. Maitri, please.
I echo everything else that everyone has said. I think this is a family dispute. I think this is a neighborhood dispute in a sense. And I think neighbors know each other best. I also would actually just add on to it, though, that I think we also need to be thinking not just of this immediate crisis, but also ensuring for more long-term transitions for Myanmar, that there's a long-term sort of plan that we can help them with, but also that maybe ASEAN members can do. And part of this has to do with the issue of the state. The state is weak, and often our investments and development and aid and so forth money goes to NGOs that tend to circumvent the state. I think that's a problem, because that means the state is not developing along with civil society. They both need to develop alongside each other. So I think it's important that ASEAN moving forward, and perhaps even with some international organizations like the World Bank and UN and so forth, can think about their practices when it comes to the support of development money. I personally think, and this is perhaps for a different discussion, that we need to develop a way of also involving young people in these types of issues. And that means perhaps forming something like an ASEAN Peace Corps, where members from the countries are trained, maybe here in Singapore, about the Asian studies, about the region, and they go up and help. So they have an invested interest in each other's countries. So these are the sorts of things, these long-term ideas, I think, may also help, not just with the immediate crisis, but going forward too.
Thank you. Thank you, Maitri. Sandy, please.
Well, that's very illuminating. So I kind of knew that, like foreign aid went to the NGOs, but I didn't know that it kind of carved out, that the state institutions were carved out from this. And, if there's a bifurcation, obviously there's going to be a lot of resentment and unequal development and so on and so forth. And obviously, the people of Myanmar would not benefit, and they would feel very unincluded from the development of their own country. So regarding, so I don't know whether I heard the question correctly regarding how ASEAN or Myanmar will deal with other international organizations at the, at the global plane. I'm not sure. If it's the military government, perhaps they would be shunned, like how perhaps like how ASEAN member states have said that they do not recognize the military government as the real government. But at a certain point in time, there will be negotiations. Well, talk with both the NLD and with the military, because you can't have you can't move ahead without talking to the disputing parties. I think the question on how other states can be involved or guiding, Myanmar back on track apart from ASEAN, I think that's a very good question. I think the big investing countries have a lot of leverage, but then what game do they play? So we don't know, right? We don't know what the agenda is as well. So I think that is also something that needs to be clarified, but obviously nobody shows all the cards at the table. One more thing that I wanted to follow up on was Professor Maitri's question regarding what does the military want, right? And just now you said that everyone wants the good of the country, the development in a certain direction, but there are disputes over, so everyone wants to get to the end point, but how to get there might be a source of dispute, and also who is going to be in charge of this, like, trajectory. That's also another thing. But perhaps some of the Myanmar people and obviously international observers are thinking that maybe the military doesn't want the best for the country or the country to develop. They might only want short-term gains, which is, power and monetary gain. So what is the real story? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. I want to make 2 points. I want to respond to one of the questions, which is about what are the prospects of ASEAN actually holding a summit meeting as proposed by Indonesia. There's a lot of behind-scene consultation. My foreign minister, Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan, has visited ASEAN chairman Brunei. The last 2 days, he was in Malaysia and held meetings with all their leaders. And today he's in Indonesia, meeting with Indonesian leaders. I think Singapore will support the Indonesian proposal to have a summit meeting, but I'm not sure whether we will get a consensus. You know, there may be no consensus on the part of the 10. So I don't know whether going forward, there could be a mini ASEAN summit consisting of 4 countries, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And for the 4 countries then to report to the bigger family when it meets in April or May. You know, so that's my analysis of the situation. My second point is that there's an elephant in the room that we have not referred to. And the elephant is China. The country with the most leverage in Myanmar is China. And the question is, how can China help? And can ASEAN and China work together? Do we have a common agenda? Can we help the NLD and military to negotiate a new compact of power sharing, a new roadmap to democracy, or is this not realistic? I'm not sure. So I asked Niloufar, I think we have time for one more round of questions. Niloufar, can we have
Yes.
one last round?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to start with one question here, which has garnered 9 votes. So this is a very popular question. So I will read it. What are the panelists' views on the CRPH within ASEAN? Will ASEAN take a stand to recognize the legitimacy of the CRPH? If not, why not? What will it take for ASEAN to recognize the CRPH that is the only credible institution that represents the Myanmar people? So that's one question. Another that I made.
Hold on. You better explain to the audience what is CRPH.
Well, I will let you. I'm not an ASEAN expert.
Maitri, help me out here. If I'm not wrong, this refers to a group of parliamentarians who have formed a coalition to represent the government that has been deposed. Am I right, Maitri?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah. But they also don't have a legal status, right? I mean, you know. So anyway, they are a stakeholder, and we need to talk to them. But we need to talk to the military. We need to talk to NLD. Okay, Niloufar, back to you.
Yeah. This apparently is the most popular question. 11 people voting for it. So, but the next, I think there have been some also questions concerning the issue, the non-interference under the ASEAN Charter for ASEAN Way, and whether this can be broken down actually into operationalized rules. So there is this, we've discussed it, but there is a question about, how can it be operationalized into concrete rules? Alternatively, is there even value in breaking down the principle into concrete rules? And as regional concerns evolve, in what direction do you see the principle developing towards? So we've been talking about non-interference, but how can we turn it into perhaps more of a rule-based approach? And there was another question similar to that. Again, that it seems to me that 2 of the ASEAN fundamental principles we are discussing today, incidentally, this is coming from a former researcher of yours, non-interference and adherence to democracy and constitutional government. They're not just legal terms, but political ones, but recognizing the ambiguity and flexibility within these principles operationalized. So these are 2 separate questions that perhaps can be the final questions for our panelists to reflect on.
Thank you. We have 10 minutes left. So what I suggest is that I'm going to call on each of the 4 panelists to respond if they wish to these last few questions. But to sum up, what is their advice to us going forward? What is the most positive and constructive thing that we can do? So I begin with Walter. Walter, please give us your words of wisdom.
I'm not sure they're words or words. You tell me. The Western mind requires rules, but there are other cultural traditions where trust is more important than rules. And ASEAN functions on trust, not rules. Rules cannot cover every eventuality, right? My other point, which is the final one I will make, is that democracy is not the natural state of humanity. It evolves, and democracy requires trust. The fact that people in Europe themselves do not trust one another is an impediment to a Europe-wide democracy. When I was based in Brussels, some people quite high up, experienced, complained to me there's no point voting because no matter how you vote, the same people you vote out come in as part of a coalition, and we don't trust them. And that is why there is a crisis. You look in America, what's happening today? It's a crisis of trust. We don't trust the other side. Now, Professor Maitri has said that Myanmar, it's a fractured society. Since 1945, it has been a fractured society. You cannot impose Western norms on a fractured society. Trust building requires generations. It's not something you can dictate by fiat. If the British had been serious about developing their colonies, they would have started in the 1900s, not just dumped, basically they buggered out all India, and they said, you're on your own, folks. Right? Generations, this is what it takes. Generation. What can ASEAN do? ASEAN can say, look, we have examples within the family where the trust has been built. It's still being built. And back to my point, it's the economy, stupid. Going back to that you really want to progress economically, which is what it's all about, for your people and for yourselves, then the ASEAN way is we do it together, we do it without shouting out loud, we will help you where we can, we will teach you what we have learned, and we will not do it in a way that a bit condescendingly, we're promoting our values. We will do it because your family, as Professor Tommy said, we care about the people. We're not abandoning you. It's just we don't believe that the Western way is going to produce any results.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. Professor Rahmat, some words of wisdom from you, please.
Thank you. I would say here that we have very practical approach to resolve issues in ASEAN. That is, we have the rule-based approach. The rule-based approach would requires the principle of rule of law, transparency, and justice. I think that is what ASEAN Charter is trying to aim to achieve its objective. But at the same time, we know very well that rule-based approach alone will not help us, will not get what we want actually at the end of the day. So there must be this hybrid of rule-based and the diplomatic way or the political approach where we negotiate, we mediate among ourselves, and we use that ASEAN ways, which has been very fruitful and positive in a manner in handling situation in ASEAN. As I said, the Western wonders how it worked, but it has worked for many, many years, for many decades. I think the best way is to look at these two, balance it, and apply it. I think that is the way forward for ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Maitri, some words of wisdom from you, please.
This will be very short and quick. So much words of wisdom before me from Prof. Woon and Prof. Rahmat. I agree in terms of the focus on the economy, and we have to do it alongside each other. But I think to go back to your previous question, which relates to this, Prof. Ko, you said, what are the common interests of China, ASEAN, and Myanmar? And I think it is in this area of socioeconomic development that may be where the bridge is. And I also think that it's not a coincidence that these are precisely the types of things that can transcend the ideological, the religious, and the political divisions that currently divide the country. So I think if we can focus on these types of things like schools and roads and comms and so forth, everyone can buy into that sort of thing, especially during a time of COVID. They need the medical and public health system in place. These are things that will bring folks together, hopefully. So I think that's maybe the route we should be thinking about too.
Thank you, Maitri. Sandy, you have the
Yeah.
privilege of making the concluding statement.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just wanted to respond to the first two questions regarding, the political, the legal, and also sort of like the legal and the practical, I think, on the ASEAN way. So I think if everyone wants to kind of see where the ASEAN way concretely is spelled out in a rule, look at the preamble and articles 1 and 2 of the ASEAN Charter. So these did not come out of thin air. They have been our traditions and our practices and our political and diplomatic practices until they were enshrined in law. So, it's not law that's imposed on us. It has been our practice and we put it as our regional law. So it's there. Right, and I think this is the way that ASEAN will operate into the future, because this is something that we are comfortable with and it works for us. Obviously, there's no 100% perfect outcome all the time, but it works and we're constantly improving. So what for Myanmar? I think in the short term, show us the proof, right, where the fraudulent elections are. And what's your roadmap to democracy and developing Myanmar for the short, medium, and the long term, so that we can really prosper as a region? I just want to implore everybody, in the region, we did well. This time last year, ASEAN did pretty well vis-a-vis COVID-19. And then we had, an opportunity advantage, but we have lost it. We have lost it.
Yeah, true.
So how are we going to be economically competitive? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Niloufar, you have the privilege of bringing this very rich and I think successful webinar to a conclusion.
Well, thank you. And indeed, it is a privilege, I have to say. And may I say that I have actually learned a great deal from our panelists. I am not an ASEAN expert at all. And understanding, and I think this is the ASEAN way, there is a different way when we think about as international lawyers. And my dear friend, Professor Dato Rahman Mohammed, talked about the Westphalian system. And here we have a counterintuitive to the Western way, but understanding that there is another way. And so to leave it to the ASEAN countries to work out this very difficult situation. The only thing I have to say at a very personal level is the first order should be stop killing people.
Yeah.
And I think that really has to be a priority, which makes it much more challenging. But this was an important discussion we had today. And I think that the international community has to trust ASEAN. That's what I'm getting from all of you. That this is a matter that has to be handled internally and not for outside interference. In theory, yes, R2P sounds great, but in practice, it has been disastrous. So thank you so much. And those are the modest words I can add to this terrific panel. And I thank all of you so much. And particularly Professor Tommy Ko, you are really the inspiration for this panel and for all of us. And we thank you so much for your guiding wisdom always.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, I guess we go.
Good luck to Myanmar.
Okay.
Thank you, and thank you to our audience. Thank you so much to our audience. Sorry if we didn't answer and ask all the questions, but we really appreciate the tremendous interest that you've shown. Good day to all.
Signing off.
Walter, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Ramad.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.